I'm delighted to be with all of you here this evening, and I'm especially grateful and honored to share this time with Father O'Collins. He really is someone that I've regarded highly for a long time, since my days as a student in the 1970s at the Gregorian University. And later, when I was rector of the Josephina Seminary in Columbus, Ohio, I had him and Walter Casper, Cardinal Casper, and Raymond Brown inaugurate a chair in honor of the late Cardinal Laghi. So we go back a long way, and I'm really honored to be with you all here tonight. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you, Brother Mark. I want to begin with a story. And I give the story being the grandson of immigrants, one who's always been interested in hearing the story of how people left their homes and their security, their families, to begin a journey into the unknown, to make a new life and to make a new home. One day I found myself sitting across a kitchen table from an elderly immigrant woman. I asked, "Tell me the story of how you came to America." "I don't want to talk about it," she snapped back, which of course made me more curious. Some people say nosy. So I pressed on. "I really would like to know." So after a bit of coaxing, she began. It was just after World War I. Her mother had died during the war from pneumonia. 6 weeks later, her father took a second wife. And the problem was that the new bride was only 4 years older than she was. The new bride being 22 and she was 18. Quickly it was clear that the two of them were not going to get along. And so, tired of the bickering, the father told the daughter that she should get out of the house every day and take the produce from their farm to the market. So each day, she loaded up the wagon, pulled by a horse that she would ride. The problem was that with the customarily required long dress, she had to ride side saddle, and something that she found difficult to do. Every few meters, she would fall off the horse, with the result that she never got to the market on time. So after a few days of coming home with rotting, unsold vegetables, her father called her in and said, "Listen, your brother is in America. Go live with him. You're no good to me." And I said to her, "You've never told anybody that story, have you?" "No," she said, with tears welling in her eyes, as though she had heard those shattering words for the first time with all of their blunt force. "I didn't want anybody to know that the last thing my father said to me was, 'You're no good to me. You're no good to me.'" But then something quite interestingly happened. It was as if a knot had been untied, as for the first time she placed that very painful moment of the past, those cutting words, against the entire rest of her life. How her father's rejection launched her on a journey that would result in quite a happy and secure life, finding a husband, welcoming children, then eventually grand and great-grandchildren into the world. For me, that story has a lot of meaning. First, because that woman was my grandmother, but also because it has given me a kind of barometer. It has centered me as a priest, reminding me that ministry is often about helping people untie knots, helping them when they're stuck in trying to make sense of their lives. This evening you've invited me to address the topic, talking about faith to a skeptical world. I do so as a pastor, as one who comes at this question not as a debater, an apologist, an advocate for defending belief over skepticism, or against outright atheism. I don't do so as a cultural warrior, distressed by the seemingly relentless attacks on faith and religion in an aggressively secular world, but as one who just tries to help people untie the knots in life, and when they do, to support and encourage them. This, of course, doesn't mean being naive about the challenges, but it does mean keeping the bigger picture of the unique contribution that we as pastors, we as believers, can make in these situations when people are stuck. Tonight I want to make 3 points. First of all, I believe that we should take up the challenge of skepticism seriously, particularly in this era of growing and aggressive secularism. Skepticism is something that's all around us, but we should not approach it fearfully. Instead, we should welcome this moment as an opportunity to embrace more fully our own discipleship and our own mission in the world. This is the approach of Gaudium et Spes, which portrays the Church as interested in discovering, quote, the hidden causes for the denial of God, because we take the questions of others seriously, and because we love all people. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what are ways in which we can understand what's happening in this age of skepticism and secularism. And I'm going to lean on some of the insights of Father Michael Buckley, a Jesuit, and his work at the origins of modern atheism, as well as Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, as I try to move us beyond a fearful, hostile approach and to find our voice to talk about faith in an intelligible way to a skeptical world, by better understanding the situation and eventually being put in a better position to help people untie the knots. Finally, I'm going to offer some concrete suggestions for talking to a skeptical world about faith, not only on the basis of the insights that these authors give us, but also from my own pastoral experience of being a priest for nearly 40 years and a bishop for 15. A serious, but not fearful approach to skepticism and secularism. We should not be naive about the situation. We're living in a different time, a different era. This is how Charles Taylor describes it. Why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, in 1500 in our Western society until, while in 2000, many of us find this not really easy, but even inescapable? Belief in God isn't the same thing in 1500 as it is today. Faith is no longer the air we breathe. But even so, the believer, like the unbeliever, must live in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. Something that Brother Mark mentioned, the Pope said to that sister. We all have our doubts. Faith isn't the air we believe. We are a people who are uncertain. Not just the out-and-out skeptic, but each one of us as believers. Making the challenge all the more unsettling is what Father Michael Buckley calls an aggressively and largely theologically illiterate new atheism, which is not interested in dialogue. People like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens collapse faith and religion into one. They insist that both have to be eradicated where possible because they undermine the common good. They rely on cartoon versions of religion. They highlight the faults of the past of the Church, an anti-Semitic history. The Inquisition is always a good flogging horse, and now child abuse. They make sweeping, uninformed generalizations about the Church's dogma. They look upon the Church's authority as overbearing in its exercise. Terry Eagleton reviewed Dawkins' book, The God Illusion, in the London Review of Books, and I rather liked what he had to say because he unmasked Dawkins' staggeringly unscholarly approach. This is how he put it. Imagine someone holding forth on biology whose only knowledge of the subject is the book of British birds. And you have a rough idea of what it feels like to read Richard Dawkins on theology. Nonetheless, we have to take these challenges seriously because these writers have become quite influential, for the media is more than eager to give them a good deal of ink and free coverage. We should also not be naive about the attempts to instrumentalize the role of government in all of this. Gaudium et Spes prophetically warned that, quote, when the proponents of atheism gain government power, they vigorously fight against religion and promote atheism by using, especially in the education of youth, those means of pressure which public power has at its disposal. Now, all of this could leave us a bit depressed, somewhat overwhelmed, concluding that the agenda of the skeptics, the atheists, the forces of secularism are going to prevail. It's only a matter of time. I hope that you have had a chance to see the movie The Life of Pi. It really is an extraordinary film. There's a scene in which the father ridicules his son Pi because he is searching for truth by going through all of the various religions. He says that his son's turn to religion is a waste of time because science will continue to discover more and more, and there will be less and less a need for religion and faith to explain things. This is what people call the secularization theory, the inevitable. Religion in time will be overcome by the unstoppable wave, the tsunami of data from science that will make religion and belief obsolete. But I have come to the conclusion that giving into our fears is no good, because it leaves us only with two equally bad options. First of all, to declare war and take a quarrelsome approach to every criticism or question about faith or the church. Or second is to live in a continual state of low-grade depression, accepting that the day of religion's demise is coming, and just hoping it's not in our time. John Paul II, during the Jubilee year, wrote a wonderful apostolic letter, Novo Millennio Innuente. And he suggested that we take a different approach, reminding us that Jesus often used the uncertainty of others to goad his followers to take a further step in the journey of their discipleship, all the while gaining a new awareness of who he is. And so this is how John Paul II deals with that text in Matthew 16 at Caesarea Philippi. He says, Jesus asked his disciples what people think of him, and they answered, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. All along, Jesus is leading the disciples, the Pope says, to take the further step of awareness, which he expects from those who are close to him, so that he can ask them, but who do you say I am? John Paul's point is simply this. We shouldn't hesitate to engage those who don't fully understand or even reject faith, because it provides us with fresh opportunity to take a further step in knowing Christ more deeply, which we need to do if we are going to bring others to him. I was ordained in 1975, and Pope Paul VI encouraged the priests who were ordained during that Jubilee year not to misread rejection, not to become defensive or hostile to people who disagree with us, nor to respond fearfully to the world's unpleasant or even hostile voices. This is how he put it. Know how to accept as an invitation the very reproach which perhaps and often unjustly the world hurls against the messenger of the gospel. Know how to listen to the groan of the poor, the candid voice of the child, the thoughtful cry of youth, the complaint of the tired worker, the sigh of the suffering, the criticism of the thinker, but never be afraid. So my first point is simply this. Yes, let's not be naive about the challenge that we face with skepticism and secularism. The situation deserves our serious attention, but it doesn't deserve panic or fear. These emotions should not shape our response. What should shape the Church's response is, as Gaudium et Spes tells us, the love of all people, a resolve to take them seriously and understand them, an awareness that Jesus often uses such challenging moments to deepen the faith of the disciples, to rejuvenate their faith, and to trust in him. I believe this is an important point because we too often see an approach that is combative. We see this in the United States, particularly with the so-called cultural warriors. It's a take no prisoners approach, but it doesn't get us anywhere. Michael Buckley and Charles Taylor help us better understand the situation, which I think is a very important point for us. Buckley tells the story of presenting his book at the origins of modern atheism to John Paul II. It's a work in which he concludes that atheism is a theory or a school with its own intellectual history and tradition. And so the Holy Father asked him, so who was responsible for the development of atheism as a tradition? Buckley succinctly responded, the theologians. In fact, that's a central claim of his book. The rise of atheism in the 17th and 18th centuries was largely due to Christian theologians who defended the faith not by appealing to the distinctive characteristic of faith, but by appealing to philosophy. Theologians of the 17th century, sensing the increasing influence of the atheistic arguments, attempted to meet the philosophical objections philosophically, rather than with the presentation of the revelation of God through Christ. They attempted to respond to the philosophical arguments of atheism head-on, abandoning the person and experience of Christ in the process. Buckley says that theologians likewise put greater emphasis on natural law arguments rather than on the Church's stupendous claims about the supernatural. In effect, we lost the debate because we lost our message. We were not faithful to the message. Charles Taylor comes to a similar conclusion when he studies the growth of secularism in his book, A Secular Age. He argues that the age of modernity is a result of a complex series of shifts in outlook, assumptions about the world and God, the human person, time, and morality. Broadly summarized, these shifts begin with the reform of the 16th and 17th centuries, which he calls an axial moment. Then they're morphed into deism, which laid the ground for today's secularism. The reform was inspired, however, by a genuine desire to return to a pure Christianity based on Scripture. It emphasized a religious quest that was more than individual or universal. It was more individual and universal than merely tribal. It was marked by a new interiority, a new consciousness of justice, selflessness, beyond practical concerns of factional protection, protecting just my group, or having the prosperity of my group. It stressed ethics over ritual and doctrine, and bestowed a new dignity on the ordinary life as a way to holiness. These are all very good impulses, very Christian impulses. It was seen as a call for mature spirituality, taking responsibility with the code of conduct based on reason, aimed at combating suffering and injustice. Considered to be an authentic development of the gospel, the individual was encouraged to live the gospel in a pure way, free of the often violent coercion of conscience, which was a sin and the stain of an earlier era, and free to commit to building a moral order of mutual benevolence. That was the impulse of the reform. God's good for creatures, then, in time became a matter of building a moral order for human benefit, and less about expressing love or praise, worship of God. This moral order is to be achieved by human benevolence, by reason, not by the active grace of God. And so we see the eventual rise of deism, where God is the divine architect and judge. Things like praise and grace, mystery, sacrament, transformation are eliminated from the here and now. And so eventually we begin to see that God becomes superfluous, a distant, disengaged individual being, who, as Karl Rahner puts it, is simply another member of the larger household of reality. God is the benevolent Zeus, who stands on the sidelines of human history, occasionally intervening, and is not the Judeo-Christian God. Deism does borrow from the Judeo-Christian belief of providence in promoting a triumph of reason and benevolence for building the moral order. And in America, that is translated into the idealism of manifest destiny. It is our destiny to take over the world. All of this brings us then to the rise of secularism. And it's very easy to see as Taylor maps out how this trajectory happened with the beginning of reform, with the evolution into deism and secularism, how an exclusive humanism of freedom, discipline, and order in society arose. All of them, these qualities, are derived from Christianity, which is striving to deliver at last what Christianity had promised. Faith ends up being stripped of much of its significance for social order and becomes a matter of just personal choice or our individual identity. Faith is uncoupled from the collectivity. We can understand how all of this leads to religion's ban from society. In the marketplaces, modernity involves the emancipation of the state, economy, science for religion, each achieving their own internal and their lawful autonomy. So religion has to go to its own sphere. Well, not being eliminated it is exiled to the private, the personal sphere. Unfortunately, we're left then with the phenomenon of believing and not belonging, of a kind of vicarious religion, in which one maintains an affectionate identification with religion. Religion is part of our ancestral memory, or a resource marking the rites of our passage, our funerals, which people show up for because of that ancestral ministry. It's a comfort in a moment of collective disaster. So, where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? Will the new phase in the trajectory that Taylor gives us bring about even greater challenges to the believer? How does laying out this full panorama of the history and the rise of modernity help us better understand the challenges that face people today? How does it make us more sensitive to their questions, but also more perceptive to new openings as we speak about faith to them? Taylor recommends, among other things, that religious leaders have to be humble and recognize the changes at the deepest levels of our understanding of the self, of society, physical nature, time. And we have to be more hesitant, he says, about making undue claims about religion's competency in politics, society, economics, law, and art. Or maybe, as Michael Buckley would say, don't keep making the same mistake of competing on their own terms, but return to the gospel. But go back to what you know works. But go back to your mission. Be confident that we have something unique to say to others. In the scene from the life of Pi mentioned earlier, after the mother hears the father's advice about forgetting religion and telling Pi to adopt reason because it eventually is going to win out, she says, yes, it's true. Reason has told us more in 200 years than religion, in 1,000 years. But reason tells us only what is out there, and religion tells us what's in here, pointing to her heart. Reminds me of the words of Blaise Pascal in the Pensée. The heart has reasons of which reason knows nothing. Those are the kinds of questions that are in the hearts of each and every human being, which we can speak to. Let's be clear, this is not just an academic exercise. Our failure to deal in a constructive way with the consequences of these series of shifts that have led to this moment of aggressive secularism has consequences. Peter Steinfels, in his very synthetic review of Taylor's book, which I benefited from as I prepared this talk, poses a question before us this way. If this situation of believing and not belonging, of vicarious religion is more and more the case, how can the institutions necessary for the formation of a genuine religious identity be maintained, examined, and renewed? In this final section, what I want to do is to offer then some concrete suggestions about how I tend to want to respond as a pastoral leader in speaking about faith to a skeptical world, and which I have already laid out for you. A hesitation to be fearful, panicky, bombastic, but also to try to understand how we got to where we are, and to understand that people are in a moment in history in which many times they're unaware of how they got there, and to see how maybe we can untie some knots for them. First, we have to take seriously, I'm going to make, in fact, 6 suggestions. The first thing is that we have to take seriously our own truth claims, for they're going to center us. They're going to be the point of reference to give direction to our response. For instance, we make some very specific claims in the Christian gospel about humanity, human dignity, and freedom. We claim, in the words of Gaudium et Spes, that human dignity lies in our call to communion with God. From the very circumstances of our origin, we already are invited to converse with God. For we would not exist were we not created by God's love and constantly preserved by it. And we cannot live fully according to truth unless we freely acknowledge that love and devote ourselves to our Creator. Statements like this should remind us that the task of bringing others to God, to that life that God intends for all of us, is really about freeing people to live fully. It's not about imposing laws. It's not about winning an argument. Fulton J. Sheen used to say that if you're interested only in winning an argument with people, you'll never win a convert. Similarly, we also believe in the indwelling of the Spirit and trust that Christ is present and working in the world and people, and that we are sent to bring to Christ. Every so often we get a glimpse of people's deep-seated concerns about God, about their questioning about the supernatural, how their own soul really throbs at times with questions about the afterlife. And sometimes we come across this in a humorous way. Some years ago I was in an airplane going back to Omaha, Nebraska on a very hot day, and the airplane was quite full. People were trying to get on. The air conditioning wasn't on, however. And I had a small bag that I thought was going to fit in the overhead compartment. And as much as I tried, it wouldn't go in there. So finally, the man next to me put his bag down and took mine and very easily shoved the bag into the overhead compartment, to my embarrassment. And then said at the top of his voice, "Well, Father, will that get me to heaven?" I was so flustered, all I could think to say was, "Gee, I hope not on this flight." But you do see people, in maybe humorous ways, in touch with the deeper questions of life, of where we're going, of what really matters. We have to believe then, in fact, that's the work of the Spirit, of Christ in the world, and we're not alone in what we do. So my first point is, let's take seriously our truth claims. The second thing I believe we have to do is promote unity within the church, so that it becomes a witness of justice and peace. We know ourselves that there really is no greater turnoff for young people when it comes to religion or politics than to see the adult world squabbling. Gaudium et Spes 21 points out, what most reveals God's presence is the brotherly charity of the faithful, who are united in spirit as they work together for the faith of the church, faith of the gospel, and who prove themselves a sign of unity. Unity, surely within our own church, is important, but also Christian unity, global unity, should be our priority if we hope to have a credible voice. In a world that's so easily fragmented today, there is a cry in the human soul for unity. The church should be at the lead for that to happen, not an instrument of division. I also believe that we need a catechesis that is encounter-based. We have to remember that for us, revelation is not primarily about God's revelation of the divine will and intention, but revelation is about God's self-gift, communication of self to us. So it's more accurate to speak of Christianity as an encounter, an event, as Benedict XVI said in Deus Caritas Est. Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. The third thing I think we as leaders have to do is trust the experience of our people, of our communities of faith, to inform us. I've learned that people have enormous resources of wisdom and experience as they face the great moral questions in our time. Not only will this enhance our understanding of the lives of others, but it will also pull us back from overreaching. Outsiders often see church leaders as heavy-handed, capricious in their judgment, asking, how can you pretend to know so much? And we have plenty of advice in our tradition about consulting the laity. From Augustine to Gregory, from Paulinus of Nola to Newman. In fact, John Paul II cites Paulinus in Novo Millennio, who urged, let us listen to what all the faithful say, because in every one of them the Spirit of God breathes. And it's interesting in the Latin, when he says that we should listen to all the faithful, the real translation is we should hang on the lips of the faithful. I've learned over the years that, in fact, people that I have come across of their age have a lot to teach me about reality, of how they negotiate raising teenagers, their marriages, dealing with moments of great tragedy. We as leaders need to listen to that collective wisdom. Shortly after I was ordained a priest in 1975, my grandmother, whom I talked about earlier, told me the story of a family decision to place their daughter, Roseanne, in a care facility. Aunt Roseanne was severely mentally and physically handicapped, and as she grew older, she put on weight, slipped into early dementia, and became uncontrollably irascible. Roseanne was just becoming too much for this aging couple to handle. They thought it right to let their pastor know that they would have to put her in a home. They couldn't do it anymore. Monsignor had been their parish priest for many years. Grandma occasionally cooked for him. After explaining their decision, his only response was the stark phrase, "You cannot do this. God would not want you to abandon your daughter in this time of need." Crestfallen, they made their way back home. Midway, my grandfather broke the silence. "Mama, now what are you going to do?" Grandma serenely responded, "Tomorrow, we're going to pack up the car with Roseanne's things and we're going to take her to the home." "But what about what Monsignor told us?" Grandpa asked. Grandma simply said, "Monsignor doesn't have to live with Roseanne." I'm fairly certain that Grandma, a 5'4" immigrant who spoke broken English, had no more than a 6th grade education, was making sure that I understood that the seminary isn't the only place to learn about how to be a priest. She also seemed to be sending me a message that I should pay attention to the real everyday experiences of people. This attitude, I believe, is a good barometer for any leader in the church today, but also makes it a lot easier for us to engage folks who disagree with us in dialogue. I also believe that we need to engage more fully and forcefully our witness to the social gospel by collaborating with people who disagree with us. And I especially note the ecology as an area. Gaudium et Spes 21 urges collaboration with atheists in ways to improve the lot of humanity, but also to build bridges with those who question our beliefs. It says the Church sincerely professes that all people, believers and unbelievers alike, ought to work for the rightful betterment of this world in which all alike live. And this particular area of the environment is something that is so rich for us. I believe it would be stunning, although there's an encyclical coming out this Friday, when the Pope writes his really own truly encyclical, if he would write it on ecology, on the environment. Not only only would it capture the imagination of and unite humanity, the scale of Pacem in Terris that John the 23rd wrote, but I think it also provides us with an opportunity to address the spiritual aspect of protecting creation by picking up on something Pope Benedict expressed in his inaugural homily. There he used the metaphor of the desert to link ecological destruction with the moral exploitation and spiritual vacuity of materialism and consumerism. This is how he put it. The external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. Benedict reminded us that our mistreatment of the environment through wasteful use of finite resources is a moral peril, not only because of future threats to human survival, but because of the kinds of people and society that infinite consumption through the wasteful use of energy fosters. As one commentator on Benedict's inaugural homilies noted, it produces people who lack depth and vigor, rather than people who acknowledge they are creatures dependent on a creator, who are shaped by virtues, the habitual practices of prudence, temperance, justice, courage, and hopefulness. I believe that Pope Francis could speak about care for the environment both as a moral and spiritual issue, and in fact have a new opening for those people who are skeptical about faith. I also believe that we need to talk openly about the role of women in the church. We have to address head-on the issues of women in the church, but I believe it's a great mistake to reduce the whole issue of women to the question of ordination. The church must engage in the larger issue of women and begin by listening to women themselves. The failure of the church to attend to the concerns of women themselves is a very serious problem. In many countries today, and certainly in the United States, where I'm from, large numbers of women are well educated. They hold positions of great responsibility in society and the government. The church has to seriously recognize what a destructive effect on the family and society will be if increasing numbers of women are drifting away from communion with the Catholic Church, which many of them love, but which many of them feel does not care about them. The church must give very serious thought to the peril it will encounter if, having lost the workers and the intellectuals of the 19th and 20th centuries, it loses youth and women in the 21st century. This is a serious matter. It will not be solved by lecturing women. It won't be solved unless men in authority in the church clearly and deeply understand that there is a very great difference between the way women approach things and the way men approach things. I have 5 sisters. I know this. These are just some of the things that I believe that we could do, and the agenda, I believe, should occupy our attention if we're serious about taking up a constructive way the task of talking about faith to a skeptical world. We need, first of all, to be resolved and not panic. We need to try to understand how we got where we are and the questions of people. But we also can take some practical steps, as I have suggested. What I continue to look for as a pastor are points of contact that will invite people living in this secular age to take a second look at what we have to say and allow them to see that we have something unique to help them untie the knots that are part of all of human life. The cultural warrior approach may seem to be our only option, given the aggressive responses to believers in religion. But in the end, it brings little results other than giving us a feeling of self-satisfaction. But even more so, it is not the way of the gospel. And to put a fine point on that, I want to end with an insight of the late Cardinal Martini, one of the presenters years ago, whom I am really proud to be able to stand at this same lecture series and offer these words. He comments on Dostoevsky's The Idiot. The cynical Hippolyte Terentiev asks the prince, Mishkin, is it true prince, that you once said that the world would be saved by beauty. And then he mockingly adds, what kind of beauty will save the world? Well, the prince doesn't respond. Cardinal Martini believes that the answer is found in the context of the prince's life. It's a life of suffering, a life of torment. The beauty that will save the world, the cardinal observed, is the beauty of sharing the pain of the other. I have learned over the years that this kind of beauty is a reliable barometer to gauge our fidelity to the mission of the Lamb who took upon himself the sin, the suffering of the world. We should aim at whether that kind of beauty is happening in our ministry, whether we are sharing the pain of the other by attending to the complaint of the tired worker, the sigh of the suffering, the criticism of the thinker, by engaging the skeptic with respect and openness to dialogue, or by just sitting at a kitchen table helping an immigrant woman let go of words of her father, "You're no good to me," and delight in the beauty of seeing her set free.